The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chayaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello, you wonderful people. Welcome back to another brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. And this one, all I can say is prepare yourself for goosebumps, because it's as seriously creepy as it is intriguing. Today, I'm going to be delving into the topic of doppelgangers. This one has actually been on my list for years after it was requested by one of our listeners who goes by the username Silent Singer. And it's also something I briefly referenced all the way back in our episode about the Avril Lavigne clone theory too. But until I started looking into it more deeply, I don't think I realised just how utterly mind-boggling this paranormal phenomenon actually is, or that there's a second, equally riveting angle to the doppelganger discussion that I'd find myself exploring too. I can't wait to share what I've learned with you, so let's get right on into it. When I say the word doppelganger, what do you think of? Is it those posts you see on social media where a stranger has found their non-biological lookalike by some strange coincidence? Perhaps it's those endless list articles about celebrities who look like they were separated at birth, which at this point feel like they're under some weird legal obligation to point out that, yes, Katy Perry and Zooey Deschanel do have a similar look. Or do you picture something altogether more sinister? Because if you said the latter, you may very well just be correct. At least in part. I have to admit that for many years, I thought of the term doppelganger as being something quite fun and playful. I attached it much more to the notion that somewhere out there we all might have a twin who we're not actually related to, but who we're so much alike that it's spooky in an exciting sort of way. But as it turns out, the origins of the doppelganger are rooted much more in the dark side of the supernatural than they are in anything more whimsical, and this is immediately evident in the dictionary definitions of the word. Whilst the Oxford English Dictionary describes a doppelganger as an apparition or double of a living person, the Cambridge Dictionary's definition is even more overtly spooky, as it states the word refers to a spirit that looks exactly like a living person, or someone who looks exactly like someone else but is not related to that person. The word itself was coined by the German author Jean-Paul in 1796 and translates into English as double goer or double walker. In Western folklore in particular, it quickly became the term then used to describe a concept that has existed in many cultures for thousands of years. The idea of a spirit double that shows itself while the person is still alive, as opposed to a ghost, which we associate as being the spirit of someone who has passed away. And whilst this spirit double isn't considered ominous in every culture, there are definitely some that have historically viewed it as more of a haunting presence than a comforting one. Take, for example, the Irish folklore figure of the fetch, which is very much on the same lines as the doppelganger. According to tradition, the fetch is a ghost of the living, which often presents itself when the person is very close to death. So naturally, it's thought of as a pretty bad omen. And as we'll see when we get to some of the most famous doppelganger stories throughout history, this idea seems like it has a whole host of real examples backing it up. There is a similar concept in Nordic folklore too, that of the filia. But in these examples, the double often comes in animal form, usually when a person is sleeping, and it's more like their alter ego visiting them as a way of foreshadowing an act of fate, which could sometimes still be their death. However, it's not just folklore tales that contain descriptions of these spirit doubles. Numerous famous literary and academic works have also heavily referenced doppelgangers, most notably Sigmund Freud's pivotal 1917 essay, The Uncanny. In this paper, Freud describes the idea of the doppelganger as something which changes, quote, "from having been an assurance of immortality, he becomes the ghastly harbinger of death. As a person grows from a child into an adult." Doppelgangers are also present in many notable works of fiction, including one from someone who seems to make semi-regular appearances on the podcast, Edgar Allan Poe. In his short story William Wilson from 1839, Poe writes about a schoolboy whose doppelganger is actually his classmate. This spirit double follows him through his life, causing trouble for him at every turn. In the end, the protagonist, who's now an adult, has had enough of this torment and brutally kills this rival figure, before it's revealed via a mirror that it's actually himself he has fatally injured. It's a very good story, I must say, although I realise I did just spoil the ending, so apologies for that. But my point is that much like other paranormal or supernatural phenomena, like ghosts, cryptids, or even UFOs, doppelgangers have been talked and written about for years upon years upon years in one form or another. So, let's take a look at some of the most gripping examples of real tales throughout history where it's thought that a doppelganger may have made an appearance, quite literally. Possibly one of the most famous stories is that of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Now, Percy was the husband of the legendary writer Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. But during the early 1820s, only a few years after the successful publication of Mary's most famous work, tragedy was about to strike. In July of 1822, whilst Percy was out on the sea off the coast of Italy, he found himself caught in a sudden storm, which ended up causing his boat to capsize. Percy was killed in the accident at the age of just 29 years old. The Shelleys, along with some of those close to them, were actually living in Italy at the time, and when the shock and devastation of the news had sunk in, the group started to speak of some strange incidents that had taken place just prior to Percy's tragic death. Not only had he been experiencing some bizarre visions in the months before his fatal accident, including thinking that he had seen some of his friends covered in blood or a child emerging from the sea smiling at him, Percy had also revealed that he had seen his own doppelganger. On one occasion, he reported that in broad daylight, he had seen his own spirit double walking towards him on the terrace outside his house, speaking to him and asking, quote, "How long do you mean to be content?" In another, much more sinister vision, Percy had told Mary that he had seen a man with his own face standing over his wife with his hands around her throat. In a letter that Mary Shelley wrote to a friend after her husband's passing, she also confirmed that Percy was not the only one to have encountered his doppelganger. Their friend, Jane Williams, who lived with them in Italy, had independently verified that she too had seen a figure that looked exactly like Percy walking past a particular window multiple times, but not backwards and forwards, in the same direction both times. This window looked onto the same terrace that Percy had described seeing his own doppelganger on, but it didn't extend around the whole house. There was no circular walk to be done. So how then had Jane seen this person who looked exactly like Percy walk past the window in the same direction twice, without him walking back on himself in the other direction? In her confusion, she asked a companion who was with her in the room whether they had seen the same thing that she had, and her friend confirmed that although they had been looking out of the exact same window, they hadn't seen Percy or anyone resembling him pass by at all. And in addition, the man himself was actually actually out far away from home that day. How creepy is that? There are lots of other strange details from the weeks and months before Percy's death too, aside from the doppelganger sightings, including the fact that the poem he was working on when he passed was called The Triumph of Life. But considering the ominous implications of a person seeing their own double, according to folklore at least, it's very odd to think about the fact that this did all take place just before his untimely passing. Another historical figure who is said to have had a run-in with his own doppelganger before he passed away was the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. There are actually countless spooky stories associated with the late president, with the most famous perhaps being the belief that his ghost haunts the White House to this day. And although his doppelganger story is less widely discussed, it's certainly no less mysterious. Now, as you may know, Lincoln was elected for 2 successive terms in office, and whilst he served for the full period in his first term, just 42 days into his second, he was assassinated by the stage actor John Wilkes Booth whilst attending a show at Ford's Theatre in Washington, D.C. You could argue that no one could have predicted the events that transpired on that fateful night in 1865. But what if someone had foreseen that Lincoln was never going to make it through his second term as president? And what if that person was his very own wife, Mary Todd? As the story goes, shortly after Lincoln was elected for the first time in 1860, he was looking in the mirror when he saw something haunting staring back at him. Beside his own face was a second figure that looked exactly like him, just with a deathly pale, almost ghostly appearance. Understandably, he was fairly shaken by what he had seen, and he attempted to recreate it by asking his wife Mary to watch whilst he stood in front of a mirror, hoping that the doppelganger would show itself to her too. Whilst Mary herself never saw the figure, Lincoln is said to have encountered it twice more whilst he was alone. But it turns out that the First Lady didn't need a direct encounter with her husband's double to believe that it was a bad omen. In fact, she developed a theory that the 2 faces that Lincoln saw reflected back at him meant that he would serve 2 terms in office, but that the corpse-like look of the doppelganger meant that he would not survive his second stint as president. And as we know, she was correct. But as fascinating as these stories are, given the time that they're from and the fact that only 1 or 2 people were involved, they're quite hard to corroborate. However, that's not the case with every doppelganger tale, and this one might be the most fascinating of all. Meet Sir George Tryon. He was a Vice Admiral in the Royal Navy during the late 1800s and had a reputation for being a very capable yet quite forceful character. And unfortunately, his strong-willed nature was doomed to be his downfall. Whilst in charge of the battleship, the HMS Victoria, off the coast of Syria in 1893, he was arguably responsible for the deaths of over 350 of his men, after giving a truly bizarre and ultimately deadly order. Whilst in close proximity to a number of other ships, including the HMS Camperdown, Tryon insisted that all of the vessels should take part in a manoeuvre where they would all turn one after the other in order to change direction. Although almost everyone else involved could see that this was a terrible idea, the Vice Admiral was adamant that it should happen, and it didn't take long at all for disaster to unfold. The Victoria and the Camperdown predictably collided, and the Victoria was unfortunately too damaged to survive. The ship sank, and Tryon, along with hundreds of mariners, went down with it. It's alleged that in his last moments, he admitted that it was all his fault, although it's not clear how this message was relayed. Now, whilst this awful event was taking place, thousands of miles away, his wife, Lady Tryon, was hosting a party at their large London home. It's said that hundreds of guests were present, and the gathering was taking place across multiple rooms in the house. It's claimed that out of nowhere, a figure which the guests knew to be Sir George Tryon appeared before a huge group of them, dressed in his full navy uniform, and walked across the room in full view of everyone before he seemed to vanish. Lady Tryon wasn't in that exact room at the time, and when one of the partygoers mentioned to her that they had just seen her husband, she replied that it wasn't possible, that he was away at sea and that they must be mistaken. But what are the chances that dozens upon dozens of people would see the same thing and all believe it to be the Vice Admiral? When the news of his death reached London and Lady Tryon was able to match up the time of the ship sinking to the apparition her guests had seen at the party, she realised that they had happened almost in tandem, and while she reportedly expressed her belief that it had been her husband's ghost, many others have since suggested that it was actually his doppelganger, warning them of his imminent death. After all, there's no description of the figure suggesting it was spirit-like. By all accounts, it really did look like Sir George in the flesh. But as incredibly captivating as these stories feel, like with other paranormal phenomena, it all comes down to a matter of belief. You'll always have some people who are 100% convinced that the doppelgangers of the folklore tales are real, and did indeed show up in the stories I've just told you. You'll also have some who are on the fence, and would perhaps only convert to full believer status if they saw the phenomenon with their own eyes. And then, of course, you'll have the skeptics who think it's all based in fantasy. I personally find myself in that middle group on this one. I think there could very well be something to this concept, but I don't reckon I could be fully convinced unless I had more of a first-hand experience with a doppelganger. But then again, if they really are these terrible omens, I absolutely do not want to. So please, if my doppelganger can hear me, stay well away. I plan to live a very long life, thank you very much. And besides, I have far too many podcast episodes to make to be dealing with any harbingers of death. That said, I did want to spend a moment taking a look at one of the key explanations that scientists have put forward in an attempt to try and explain this strange phenomenon. One of their leading ideas is that something called heutoscopy could be at play. This is a super rare psychiatric phenomenon which involves a person seeing themselves in a form of out-of-body experience. Both Percy Shelley's and Abraham Lincoln's experiences have been cited in research papers as being possible examples of heutoscopy in action. And in one particular 2011 paper published by a team in Italy, it suggests that the phenomenon could be linked to other conditions such as anxiety, depression, and even schizophrenia. I'm no doctor myself, of course, but it's interesting to note that both men presented with their doppelganger experiences at very stressful times in their lives. Percy Shelley was experiencing unhappiness in his marriage and was said to have been behaving erratically before his accidental death. And as for Abraham Lincoln, I'm sure that becoming the President of the United States wasn't exactly an anxiety-free time. And although this does sound like a sensible and rational explanation, it really only works when we're talking about someone who has seen their doppelganger with no other witnesses to corroborate it. That was the case for Lincoln, but it was definitely not the case for Shelley, as we know that others also saw his spirit double at his house when he himself was miles away from home. The heutoscopy theory also wouldn't apply at all to the story of Sir George Tryon, where dozens, if not hundreds of people all claim to have seen the doppelganger with their own eyes, which ultimately reinforces my on-the-fence stance. So, as endlessly intriguing as these otherworldly tales are, all of this then led me off on a different yet ultimately related tangent. It got me wondering whether the reason that the word doppelganger is now much more frequently linked to those strange moments where someone finds or even meets their real-life lookalike than it is to the paranormal is because this is much more tangible for people to get their heads around. And the more I thought about how the usage of this word has changed, and the further I read into this secondary topic, the more strange I realised it was in its own right. So I also want to tell you about a few things I found out about the earthly applications of the word during my research. And rest assured, this is all still pretty bizarre. In 2015, a research team from the University of Adelaide in Australia, led by Tegan Lewis, set out to try and determine the statistical chance that two people could look so alike that in a court of law, the wrong person could reasonably be accused of committing a crime that had, in fact, been perpetrated by their living, non-biological double. According to an article from the BBC, what Tegan found was, quote, good news for the criminal justice system, but likely to disappoint anyone pining for their long-lost double. The chances of sharing just 8 dimensions with someone else are less than 1 in a trillion. However, because this study was based on very exact measurements, and for example, if 2 people were virtually identical, save for one having a distance of 30 millimeters between their nostrils and the other having 29 millimeters, then they wouldn't count as an exact match. Many have since argued that it might be much more about an individual's perception. Essentially, the way our brains perceive faces might not be quite so clear-cut, and might have less to do with individual facial features than the overall look a person has. This could explain why we may think in our minds that 2 people look alike when we observe them separately, but when they're put together in a single image, they look similar but definitely not identical. I think most of us have an example for this, and being a huge Formula 1 fan, mine is to do with the legendary Ayrton Senna and the young current F1 driver Franco Colapinto. Now, when you see a side-by-side edit of the 2 together in 2 separate pictures, there definitely is a resemblance there, although it's clear that a number of their features are quite different. But for some reason, I've got to the point where I'll be watching a post-race interview or a social media clip of Franco, and my brain is convinced that he must be the reincarnation of Senna because they're absolute 100% doppelgangers, even though I know they're not identical. This isn't a perfect example, as Senna did tragically pass away almost 10 years before Colapinto was born, so they're not 2 living people who look alike. But I also find myself applying the same thinking to other celebrity pairs, like Amy Adams and Isla Fisher, for example. I admit that lookalikes are something I've always found interesting, and it appears that there may be a good reason for that. Research shows that this fascination could actually be down to evolution, and the fact that we would naturally scan for similarities to ourselves in others to find clues that we may be related. And it seems that I'm very much not alone in my interest. Take the Canadian artist Francois Brunel. After years of being told that he bore a resemblance to Rowan Atkinson, particularly in his role as Mr. Bean, Francois decided to turn his fascination with the idea of living doppelgangers into a photography series. Over the course of 12 years, he set about finding over 200 pairs of people who looked remarkably alike, and arranged for them to meet for a photo shoot where he aimed to capture their likeness to one another. The photos are actually quite amazing because they really do show in action what I just mentioned a minute ago. Whilst the pairs do definitely look very similar and in some cases almost identical when you move your eyes between them individually, when you look at the images in their entirety, you can pick out out the sometimes subtle differences in their features. But things were taken one step further after this project went viral and caught the attention of a Barcelona-based researcher named Dr. Manel Estella. Dr. Estella invited 32 of the duos discovered by Francois to undergo a series of tests, which included DNA testing as well as questions about different aspects of their lives. What he discovered was incredible. It was found that half of the pairs who were studied were true lookalikes, based on reports from the facial recognition software he used, and that those true doppelgangers did actually share significantly more genes than the pairs who didn't meet this genuine lookalike threshold according to the software. Dr. Estella told the New York Times that he believed that due to an increase in our population size, it's as though the system is repeating itself. And this does make sense. I guess if you think about all of the different facial characteristics, from hair colour to eye colour to the size and shape of someone's nose or lips or eyes, there are bound to be some combinations of those that will match up more closely in certain pairs of people somewhere in the world. It wasn't just their genetic code that was similar though. The study found that many of Francois' doppelganger pairs also shared other things in common. For example, things like whether they were a smoker or a non-smoker. And whilst all of this is fascinating and was made possible by the fact our world is now so much more connected thanks to the internet, particularly social media and even dedicated apps to help people find their real life lookalike, there is a much darker side to the fact that people can now find their living doppelgangers much more easily. Over the past few years, there have been a number of serious criminal cases in which someone has sought out their doppelganger online, using social media for example, and actually ended up seriously harming or even killing them in order to either steal their identity or fake their own death, tricking the authorities into believing that their lookalikes' remains were their own. One such story that could easily be its own entire episode took place in Germany back in 2022 and was actually nicknamed the Doppelganger Murder by the German media. A young woman named only as Sharaban K, who was in her early 20s at the time of the incident, was sentenced to life in prison in 2024 after being found guilty of murder. Her victim was 23-year-old Khadija O, an Algerian beauty blogger who lived in a place we've mentioned before here on the podcast, the German city of Heilbronn. It's said that Sharaban sought out Khadija via Instagram as the two bore a striking resemblance to one another, but her motives were far from innocent. Sharaban was embroiled in a family dispute and felt that her way out of it was to fake her own death and disappear to begin a new life. Her plan was to convince Khadija to meet her in person, take her life, and then have her family identify the body and believe it really was Sharaban. And whilst the family did initially confirm that the murdered woman was Sharaban, an autopsy that was performed just the next day raised some major red flags. It quickly became obvious that the victim was not Sharaban at all, and very predictably, this horrific, ill-devised plan soon unravelled. Poor Khadija was identified as the true victim, and Sharaban was arrested on suspicion of murder along with a male accomplice. After they were both found guilty, most of the commentary around the crime was filled not only with intense sympathy for Khadija, but also questions around why on earth Sharaban ever thought she could get away with something so evil yet so ridiculous. No matter how alike the two women had looked on the outside, the truth was always going to come out in the autopsy. Very, very dark stuff indeed. I wanted to round things off today with a sort of final thought, something that I've been mulling over as I've been putting this episode together. A lot of the examples of the allegedly paranormal doppelganger sightings took place a long time ago, before the days of mass media and certainly before social media. Back then, I think you could quite safely argue two things. One, that most people had seen far fewer faces than the average person has now, now, when you take into account not only everyone we've seen in real life, but on TV and on the internet over our lifetime. Us taking in that many different faces must have had some effect on our facial recognition skills, right? And two, when you take into account how widespread and widely adopted things like beauty or grooming trends are now, I don't think it's too much of a hot take to suggest that more people look more similar to one another than they may have previously, if the aesthetics of a particular facial feature become hugely popular, like we saw in the mid-2010s with Kylie Jenner's lips, for example. You suddenly have thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then potentially millions of people striving towards achieving this shared characteristic, something that wasn't necessarily possible hundreds of years ago, especially if we're talking about the augmentation of facial features. My point is that in centuries past, seeing someone who looked very much alike you would have been much more shocking than it would be now, and it makes me wonder whether at least some of the folklore and intrigue around the idea of the doppelganger was born out of the fact it would have seemed so much more unsettling back then. And all of these musings led me to the admittedly quite eerie question I want to leave you with today. If our doppelganger, paranormal or very much human, walked past us in the street in 2026, how many of us do you think would even notice? Oof, I kind of gave myself goosebumps at the end there. Honestly, when I first started my research for today's episode, I had no idea just how creepy parts of this were going to end up being. On both sides of the coin, to be honest. There were definitely dark sides to both the folklore examples and the non-supernatural ones too. I would genuinely love to hear your answer to the question I posed to you. And of course, I'd also be very interested to know your thoughts on doppelgangers in general. Are you a believer in the spookier side of the topic? Have you ever met someone who looked weirdly similar to you? I cannot wait to read your comments about this one. But for now, it's time for us to head on over to our Weird Media outro feature. And this week's recommendation is another absolute gem. Now, if you've watched the show I'm recommending in Weird Media today, you'll understand why I'm sitting here still with my head in my hands trying to deal with the finale episode that we were treated to very recently, because my head is still spinning so much that holding it still is actually the only option. I am talking about the triumph that is The Night Manager. So back in 2016, 10 years ago now, the BBC released this brilliant 6-part series featuring the most incredible cast, which includes Tom Hiddleston, Hugh Laurie, and the legend that is Olivia Colman, which essentially tells the story of how Tom Hiddleston's character, who is the night manager of a hotel, gets embroiled in this wild mission to bring down this tyrant hiding in plain sight, played by Hugh Laurie. I didn't actually watch it at the time, but when I heard that it was coming back for a second series a decade on, I decided to catch up with it ahead of the release of Series 2. I was absolutely hooked from the first episode, and now that I've just finished watching the second series, I honestly can't get it out of my mind. I'm not going to spoil any part of the plot, but if you enjoy complex, undercover spy dramas or shows that really dial up the tension to the point where you can hardly watch, The Night Manager is the show for you. And like me, you're lucky because you now have 2 seasons to go at without having to wait 10 years in between. Plus, Tom Hiddleston has actually confirmed that there will now be a 3rd series, so it's the perfect time to add it to your watch list. I actually think I might have to re-watch the last episode, even though I've only just seen it, because there was so much to take in that I haven't fully processed it. If you've already checked out The Night Manager, please let me know what you thought of that finale. Are you still as speechless as I am? All I can say is that it really was something special. Thank you all very much indeed for hanging out with me today. I'm so glad that you decided to join me. There will be shout outs to all of the sources I used during my research in the show notes or description box, along with links if you'd like to do some further reading after the show. I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address for you too. Please do get in touch on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, or even TikTok, and let me know what you made of today's topic. If you've enjoyed this episode and have a spare moment or two, one of the best free ways to support the show is with a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you once again for being here today, and I hope to see you again next time when I'll be back with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.